In this episode, we're going to talk about charity, prophecy, and hierarchy. Here we go. So in this episode, we're going to cover chapter 14 of 1 Corinthians. The following episode will cover chapters 15 and 16. What we get here in chapter 14 is kind of a follow-up on what Paul has gone over in 1 Corinthians so far, where he has focused a lot on charity and on spiritual gifts. And as we've stated previously, it's interesting that faith, hope, and charity are brought together with spiritual gifts. Mormon and Moroni do the same thing. They bring this train of attributes of faith, hope, and charity, what I would call attributal progression, along with spiritual gifts. And what Paul ends up doing here, remember that he previously, in talking about faith, hope, and charity, he says that even if you have hope in Christ, it's not enough. Faith isn't enough. And he said that of these three, faith, hope, and charity, charity is the most important. So he's done something here. Just like in the last episode, we talked about creating a hierarchical structure where he goes back to the Garden of Eden and he talks about God the Father being the source of Christ and Christ being the source of man and man being the source of woman. He's put together kind of this hierarchy of origin. And that's what he does a lot in these epistles. And that's what the gospel is really about, is about hierarchical structures. And here's why. And if you've been a listener for a long time, you know that I've talked a lot about hierarchy and about what I call a fluid hierarchy. Because in a gospel sense, you have to have something above you that you are shooting for. You have to have a place where you are able to progress to. And you have to have a place where someone can reach out a hand to help you. And then on the other side, you have to have someone, people, others, where they are looking to you as an example and as a strength, and where you can reach down and pull them up. That is all about a hierarchical structure. And a lot of times we get this idea, I even heard this very recently here, that all of these spiritual gifts that Paul talks about are the same. They're all of equal value. That sounds good, right? It sounds neat. Just like saying a lot of things are the same. But that's not the way the gospel works. It can't work that way. There has to be a hierarchical structure. And Paul is pointing that out. And he continually goes through these hierarchical structure. He even says, with faith, hope, and charity, that charity is the greatest of the three. So there is a difference. There is a value, a greater value given to charity than there is to faith and to hope. One is more important than another. Remember, we can go back to Lehi's teachings. He has what I would call a philosophical teaching, a philosophical theological teaching in 2 Nephi 2. And he goes back to the Garden of Eden too, and the creation story, to get back to this. And one thing that he talks about is that there must be opposition in all things. And I think that you can carry that one step further and understand what he's saying, that doesn't mean just good and evil, right? You can't just say, okay, everything is good and everything that's good is the same. And everything that's evil is the same. That's not how it works. There are levels, there are degrees of going to the dark side, so to speak, and there are degrees of reaching up higher and higher toward progression. There has to be. And that has to go on for an eternity. So we want hierarchical structures in the world and in the cosmos out there, because it gives us something to aim for, and it gives us something to warn us against going the other way. We need that. We need context with things. That is part of partaking of the fruit of the knowledge of the tree of good and evil, right? It's not just good and just evil. There are lots of degrees of evil. There are lots of degrees of good. So he's been going over these hierarchies throughout Corinthians and back even in Acts and in Romans. And one of those hierarchies that he now goes over, he doesn't go specifically into each one of the levels, but he now takes all these spiritual gifts that he's talked about, and he's going to separate a couple of them. And he's going to say one is good and one is better, right? And that's the way the gospel works. And so this is what he says here, starting out in verse 1 of chapter 14. Follow after charity and desire spiritual gifts, but rather that ye may prophesy. Now, if we were to go back and see a better translation of this, we would say, and desire spiritual gifts, and rather that ye may prophesy, or especially that ye may prophesy. That would be Weymouth's translation. And so, again, there's a lot of spiritual gifts out there, but especially prophecy. Now, another thing to think about here before we go into these spiritual gifts is, why is charity always tied in with all these spiritual gifts here and in the Book of Mormon? And I think one way to think about this is that as this hierarchy has already been set up by Paul with faith, hope, let's do it this way, faith, hope, and charity, that the spiritual gifts, as they are set up into a hierarchy also, what they do is they allow us to take these spiritual gifts, no matter what level they are at, and help those that may not have that spiritual gift. And we've talked a lot about covenant, right? And I think that's where charity comes in. It's, how do I use what the Lord has given me to love others, to help others, to serve others? And so every time these spiritual gifts are talked about, and always a list of all these different gifts, charity is brought up to be coupled with that, because it's charity that is required to use those spiritual gifts to lift others up. Now back to the spiritual gifts. What Paul is going to do here in chapter 14 is he's going to talk about two gifts of speaking. And the first one is the gift of tongues. And then the second one is the gift of prophecy. So both of these are things that would be spoken. And so he's going to contrast the two of them and show how one is better than the other. He's constantly going in and setting up this different values hierarchy with the things that he's talking about. So here's what he says. For he that speaketh in an unknown tongue, or as the JST, the Joseph Smith translation, would say, of another tongue or another language, speaketh not unto men, but unto God, for no man understandeth him. Howbeit in the Spirit he speaketh mysteries. But he that prophesieth speaketh unto men to edification and exhortation and comfort. So basically what he's saying is one is a little bit more like the lower law. It's good for you, right? Remember, the lower law is about the individual. This gift of tongues is something that it may be a great experience for you. It may be spiritually edifying to you. But the gift of prophecy is much better. It is more of a higher law spiritual gift. And it is something that edifies those that are around you. So that is the contrast that he's setting up there. And that is a little bit of hierarchy that he's putting into these spiritual gifts. And he summarizes the individual aspect of the gift of tongues and the community aspect of the gift of prophecy as follows here in verse 4. He says, he that speaketh in an unknown tongue, in another tongue, edifieth himself. But he that prophesieth edifieth the church. Right, so again, one is for the individual. It's important. It's good. But the other edifieth all those around him. It edifieth the community, would edify your family, would edify the ward, the church, the community, etc. And then he compares it to musical instruments and basically says, look, this is speaking in another language is almost like having a bunch of musical instruments that aren't following musical theory. Just somebody just banging out something that's not in rhythm. And you can imagine somebody just playing the piano, just however, just knocking on keys. There's no order to it. There's no direct communication to the ear that makes sense. They're not following fifths and octaves and etc. And so That's a lot like speaking in tongues, he says. Others don't understand what is going on, so what good is that to anyone but yourself? So he says down in verse 12, even so ye, for as much as ye are zealous of spiritual gifts. So this is obviously something where there was a lot of talk about this. How do we get the gift of knowledge? How do we get the gift of prophecy? The gift of tongues seems to have been something that the church in Corinth was really pursuing. And Paul tells us that he spoke in tongues. I'm not sure exactly what that means, but he says that he spoke in tongues while he was with them in Corinth. So maybe that's why. That's something that they really seek after. And he's saying, hey, that's good, but it's not great. So again in 12, even so ye, for as much as ye are zealous of spiritual gifts, seek that ye may excel to the edifying of the church. So there's a lot of things, for example, and I get stuck in this sometimes, where I really like to study the gospel, and I like to study principles, and kind of get this individual, personal, selfish to some degree, knowledge and fulfillment from just knowing, right? But unless I'm using some kind of a gift to be able to share that with somebody else that helps them, then really I'm just following a lower law. I'm really just in the Aaronic law. It's just only for me. It's an individual gift. And what I need to be pursuing is something that will be a gift that could help somebody else and share with someone else or edify somebody else. And Paul gives us this in comparing the two. He says in verse 19, yet in the church I had rather speak 5 words with my understanding than by my voice I might teach others also, than 10,000 words in an unknown tongue, or another tongue, as Joseph Smith says. So in other words, again, I'd rather give a little bit that helps somebody else, even just a small amount, than something that just helps me personally, a large amount, which is an interesting concept. Right there he is telling us, look, whatever helps you individually is good, but a large amount of that help for you individually does not compare to a small amount that you can give to someone else. And I think that's a real true principle. A lot of people that say may have depression or are struggling with difficult times or they're in a difficult place emotionally or mentally, it seems that the more you focus just on yourself, it sometimes seems like that's the natural thing to do. The more you focus on yourself, the harder it is to get out of that state of mind, to get out of those emotions. But when you get outside of yourself and you serve others and you help others and you focus on their needs, then that is what typically lifts people out of a bad place. That would be at least what Paul is saying here in comparing the value of these two things, internal and external spiritual gifts. And then we get just a little bit of a smidgen here of a ward meeting, we might call it. We don't really have anything that has been found, written down, or any archaeological evidence that gives us much information about how the early meetings of first century Christians went. Certainly not during the time of Paul. So we get just a little bit of maybe what they did sometimes in these meetings. And we start off here with not only that some people speaking in tongues, but we have some guidelines that Paul gives to the branch here in Corinth. He says, let the prophets speak 2 or 3. Now here when he's saying prophets, he's either talking about the leaders of the branch, of the ward, of the stake, whatever we might have here, or the unit, or he's talking about those that are prophesying. And in that sense, it would be men or women. But he says here, let the prophets speak 2 or 3, and let the other judge. So you might get up and say something about the gospel. Maybe that's what they're talking about prophecy. It's truth. You're bearing truth. Or maybe they're talking about things that they see and understand within the gospel. Maybe they're talking about testimony. It's hard to know always what they're talking about when they say prophecy here. But then it says, if anything be revealed to another that sitteth by, let the first hold his peace. So in other words, have a conversation here. And if something comes to mind to someone, let them talk. Maybe this is a little bit more like a Sunday school environment. Hopefully, a Sunday school environment. For ye may all prophesy one by one, that all may learn and all may be comforted. So we can see here another nuance to what he says here when he uses the term prophecy. Maybe everybody can stand up and say something about the gospel, about the topic that's being discussed. Sounds like a big conversation. And then he says something important here that we follow today as well. In verse 32, it says, and the spirits of the prophets, or those that are speaking, are subject to the prophets. So in other words, look, we can all have these ideas and say these certain things, but there is an overlaying doctrine that needs to be followed. But the principle here that Paul is talking about is, look, there is a hierarchy of doctrine. And the prophets and apostles that are speaking, that is at the top, along with the scriptures, which are the apostles and the prophets. And so that hierarchy comes down in importance or in value or in surety, right? So we can speak what we want and say what we want, say it's even in Sunday school or it's in our Relief Society or Elders Quorum, but the more sure word of prophecy is going to come from the prophets, seers, and revelators. And maybe somewhere down at the bottom of that hierarchy is Cwic Media, perhaps. And then Paul says something really interesting here, following up with that hierarchy of the doctrine here. He says, for God is not the author of confusion, but of peace, as in all churches of the saints. So again, what is peace? We think about, what does that mean? Does that mean everything's just kind of, what are they talking about when they say peace? Think about one of the titles of the Savior, of the Messiah, and that is the Prince of Peace. He is the author of peace. In that annual temple drama at the Feast of Tabernacles that we've talked about many times, one of the names of the covenant that was put in place there with the people and the king and maybe the prophet at that time was the covenant of peace. And the idea is in that day of atonement where the high priest and the king are involved perhaps, you have the sprinkling of the blood on the altar, in the Holy of Holies, on the Ark of the Covenant, perhaps on the people even. You have a cleansing of the temple, a cleansing of the high priest and his family. You have a cleansing of the tribes of Israel. You have a cleansing of the land of Israel. And this was something that was supposed to create a peace. And everything was bound together as in the creation from this covenant, right? This binding covenant of peace. And Jesus Christ is the author of that covenant of peace. What is the name of the holy city? It is Salem. That is what it was called at the time of Melchizedek. And what does Melchizedek mean? The king of righteousness, or another term could be, similar term would be Prince of Peace. And being the king of Salem, he was the king of peace, right? Salem is shalom, it's peace. Or Jeru-shalom, right? Jeru-shalom or Jerusalem. So he is the king of Jerusalem. He is the prince of Jerusalem. King in the sense that maybe he's the father, and prince in the sense that maybe he's the son. So there is an author of confusion as well. And in that drama, he's very familiar to all of us. He is chaos. And he is the opposite of what Paul here is speaking of with an order. We talk about order and chaos, with an order that is set forth through hierarchies. And then we get to another controversial subject on gender roles. And here we have Paul again talking about women and how men and women should behave in church. And so let's try and unravel this a little bit and see if we can understand what he's trying to say here. First of all, again, the preface to this is first century Roman world, right? This is in Corinth. It is the square peg, or part of the square peg of history that's existed for most of human history, that does not fit into the round hole of modernity of our time today. It just doesn't fit. So there are a lot of cultural issues that would be seen as appropriate, not just because of behavior, but actually theologically, to try and hold things together between these pagans that are members of the church, that have a very, very different background, and the very staunch Pharisaical Jews that are also here. And how do you bring that together? How do you reconcile this? So he is navigating these waters between these cultures, and he is obviously of a first century culture. So here's what it says. In verse 34, it says, "Let your women keep silence in the churches." Ouch. "For it is not permitted unto them to speak." See, in this time when they were speaking this, and he's writing this letter, this is not controversial, right? This is not misogynist. There are different roles for men and women. Women were domestic, and going out into the world, including church, there would have been separate roles that the men followed and that the women followed. Not because of oppression, but because of societal and natural demands on survival and progress. So then he follows up and he says, "But they are commanded to be under obedience, as also saith the law." So the law is the law of Moses. So let's talk about this just a little bit. First of all, real important thing to know, and you're not going to see this in your King James Version of the inspired scriptures with its footnote, but there is, apart from the JST, the Joseph Smith translation, the little blurbs that you get in the King James Version, there is a much fuller Joseph Smith translation that we have that is not in the scriptures, in the LDS scriptures. And in this verse here, Joseph Smith does change a word here. He changes the word speak. And this is how it changes the verse. Let's read it again on this. And instead of the word speak, we use the word rule. Okay, that's what Joseph Smith put in here. He said, "Let your women keep silence in the churches, for it is not permitted unto them to rule, but they are commanded to be under obedience, as also saith the law," which most of the other men would have been under the obedience, because they wouldn't have been the rulers of the congregation. Right? We say rule, that sounds crude to us, but the leaders, the bishopric, those that hold the keys in whatever their position might be. So it kind of sounds like what they're saying here is that it is up to the men holding the priesthood to run the meetings, and not for the women. And that isn't any different from today. I've seen some commentaries on this where they say, in that day, the men ran the meetings. And I'm thinking, well, wait a minute, it's the same thing here today. That's not different. Of course, there are other meetings that the women run, but if there is a presiding priesthood holder, then that priesthood holder would run the meeting. We still have that division, right, of different roles within the church. Now, that is changing a lot. Who knows how much it'll change? I don't know. But it changes again. It changes because of our modern world. Technology and changes that have given women many, many more options have completely changed the world. In many ways, for good. So men are to be the priesthood holders and those that are running the meetings at church. And then 35, still going through this, it says, "And if they will learn anything," this is the women, "let them ask their husbands at home, for it is a shame for women to speak in the church." And again, Joseph Smith replaces speak with rule, right? "For it is a shame for women to rule in the church." So is Paul giving us a doctrine that is theologically firm and set, or is he giving us a cultural reflection of the time? Well, for the most part, at least as far as what has been revealed to the brethren at this point, it seems theological, and that women are given many roles and the ability to create life in partnership with God, the greatest power that there is, and men are given the priesthood. And what is going to be interesting to see as we see this evolution of men and women in their roles and this fight with gender is how the family unit is going to survive through this. Will it flourish? Will it stay even keeled? Will it disintegrate? That doesn't mean there isn't some cultural fluff in there, right? I mean, look at the difference in the church even in the last 50 years. When I was growing up, women didn't pray in church, in sacrament meeting. That was culturally acceptable. So there is obviously leeway in between this as society changes, as culture changes. But where does it hit up against, I don't know, something firm? But you've got to take, I think, all of these, when you think about these things and these societal currents, these cultural currents that are out there that can be good or can be bad. You've got all of these moving parts going, right? You have got the family, which is paramount. You have got gender. With such a fast change in culture, you have an even wider gap in the generation gap in many things. So that's parents to children and their relationships. It's going to be very interesting to see how the church responds to these cultural currents. And these parts moving around, can they be juggled around, or do they need to stay in a specific order? And that is what Paul is going over here, be it theological and doctrinal or cultural on the other end. He's talking about order, and he's talking about hierarchical structures. And here we wouldn't say, again, that the man is superior to the woman. I think that if we were to go back to last week and talk about the hierarchy of origin and source from, again, as I said, the father at the head, which means the source, and then Christ and he's the source of Christ. Christ is the source of man, and man is the source of woman. What we might look at there is not a hierarchical structure of importance or authority even, but maybe it is a hierarchy of leadership. And if we looked at the family proclamation, we might see something like that. And some people aren't going to want to hear that. But I'm just trying to say, what is it that we read in this? Or do we just ignore it? And I choose not to ignore it. I think it needs to be discussed. And so then Paul finishes up here in chapter 14, bringing together these points. He says here in verse 39, "Wherefore, brethren, covet to prophesy, and forbid not to speak with tongues." So in other words, what you really want to aim for is that value that is high in the hierarchy of prophecy, of maybe testimony that can be shared with others to strengthen them. And forbid not to speak with tongues, but allow the lower gift. That's important too. It's not as high as what you should be aiming for. And maybe as we go through, again, we're going to see more hierarchy in the next episode with the three kingdoms as he talks about baptisms for the dead. And maybe we might say, hey, prophecy here is more of a celestial gift, and maybe speaking with tongues is more of a terrestrial or telestial gift. There are hierarchies, and that's okay. And as I speak about fluid hierarchies, what that means is it doesn't matter even where you are within a hierarchy, as long as that hierarchy for you is fluid. And that means that you have opportunity to choose, not a right to instantly be put into one place, but the right to be able to get where you want to go and to be who you want to be and to be able to fulfill the divine promise as a son or daughter of God that you inherently have. I'll talk to you next time.